The world's writers will walk through those gates, and if you hang around, you get a chance to talk to them.
I'm interested in conversations that deal with things that matter, but real, how do we live our lives?
First of all, make climate change personal in your life. The second step is get angry and get active. And the third step, and believe it or not, I think this is the most important. We have to imagine this world that we want to hurry towards.
It's about kindness is looking at people as people and not as I voted this, I do this, whatever it is. There's some people we will never get along with, but most of us are a complex mass of different things.
Hello, I'm Ian Rankin. I've been with the Edinburgh International Book Festival basically since day one. I went as a student, as a reader, as a fan of writing. Later on, I was invited to go as an author, which was a thrill. And it's a spectacular experience. It's a meeting of minds. It's a way to open your mind to new experiences, to new ideas, nuanced debate, entertainment, something for every age group. And that's what keeps me going back year after year after year. Long may it continue.
Welcome to the online Edinburgh International Book Festival. I am Raja Shehadeh, writer and lawyer, and the co-chair of our panel, Shifting Sands, 5 years on, What Future for the Middle East? This is a Scottish Mortgage Investment Trust event, and we would like to thank the Trust for supporting the festival.
And I am co-chair Penny Johnson, also writer and editor. Raja and I are speaking to you from our home in the Palestinian city of Ramallah. When all of us met in Edinburgh's Charlotte Square in 2014 for the 5 panels that became this book, Shifting Sands, The Unraveling of the Old Order in the Middle East, Israel's summer war in Gaza was raging, and the Islamic State had just taken over the Iraqi city of Mosul. We were also marking the 1-year anniversary of the new Egyptian military regime's security services, killing over 800 demonstrators in Cairo's Rabaa Square in August 2013. The scale of wars and catastrophes has only grown since then. And the separation of people and power we identified at the time is ever more acute. Witness the government versus the people in the tragedy that has befallen the city of Beirut. In this session, we will probe what is changing and what endures, and possibly offer some resources for hope, however fragile.
In our panel, we bring together 5 of the writers from Shifting Sands. historians Khaled Fahmy and Avi Shlaim, journalist and writer Alif Scott, writer of fiction Mai Al-Nakib, and sociologist Salim Tamari. They will be exploring issues ranging from the effects of the pandemic on the region to the origins of the conflict and violence of the last 100 years. We will be asking whether authoritarian regimes can be challenged and how, and exploring the role of writers and changing forms of cultural expression at this complicated present juncture. Avoiding the sound bites that sometimes characterize discussions of the Middle East, we will think together about the possible futures of our embattled region. Penny and I will alternate, asking each participant a question. Each will speak for about 5 minutes, and we will ask a final question to round up this session.
Our first speaker, Khaled Fahmy, is a historian of the modern Middle East at the university and the Sultan Qaboos bin Said Professor of Modern Arabic Studies at the University of Cambridge, and recently elected a Fellow of the British Academy. Khaled taught at the American University of Cairo for many years and was an active participant and chronicler of the Arab Spring in Egypt. His latest book is In Quest of Justice, Islamic Law and Forensic Medicine in Modern Egypt. Welcome, Khaled. Khaled, in your essay for Shifting Sands, you asked a question for yourself and for all of us. How did the Arab Spring morph into an Arab nightmare out of which we seem unable to awake? You gave 5 factors, including the scourge of petrodollars and the rise of political Islam, but you end with the hope that the genie is out of the bottle. 5 years later, is that hope alive? And do the same or other factors stand in hope's way? Khaled.
Yes, I believe this hope is still alive. And despite the fact that the factors I have enumerated are still in full force, if not much fiercer, I believe the current bleak moment, despite its bleakness, will not last forever. But let me be clear, the current moment is indeed very, very bleak. Civil war is being waged in Yemen and Libya, and the counter-revolution has scored an unambiguous victory in Syria, in Egypt, and in Bahrain, with a brutal crackdown on democracy activists, a serious curtailment on press freedom, a spike in torture and extrajudicial killings, and a resumption of capital punishment, especially in Egypt. Those pro-democracy activists who have been lucky enough to have evaded death and imprisonment have been imposed in self-imposed exile in Europe and in the US. As I mentioned 5 years ago, our revolutions were up against formidable forces. Our quest for democracy, for freedom, for justice was never easy or smooth. We were not dealing simply with a tyrant here or a despot there. Rather, our struggle was a serious one. It was a struggle against systemic failure of our post. At the core of this failure is the insistence of these states, once they got rid of European colonial powers, to hold on to power and to deprive the masses of any real role in running their own societies. The republics that were formed in the 1940s and 1950s were republics with no publics. This is why the Arab Spring was particularly challenging for these regimes. For millions took to the streets, demanding to have a say in how their own countries are being run. Those multitudes we saw in numerous Arab cities were insisting on trying open the black box of politics that these regimes have monopolized for decades. But rather than seeing the urgency of undertaking systemic reforms or opening up this black box of politics, as I call it, those in power deduced, in my mind, the wrong lessons from the Arab Spring. The answer, they believed, was not to include the masses in running their own societies or to have a new social contract, but to tighten their own grip on power, build more prisons, and send more people to the gallows. This brutal counter-revolutionary moment has been successful largely because of the billions of petrodollars spent to boost these repressive regimes and to stop the revolutionary tide from reaching the oil-rich Arab Gulf countries. In addition, foreign governments in Russia, in China, in the US, and in Europe have been telling themselves, better the devil we know. Despite this bleak moment, I still think it is but a moment, and that time is on our side. For the counter-revolution may be brutal and vicious, but it is sterile and unimaginable. There is no new social contract and no new ideas of how to share power. By contrast, Arab youth are full of ideas and imaginative solutions to their society's ills. Social media is abuzz with perceptive prognosis of our problems and creative ways to confront them. The regimes might have tightened their grip on traditional media, but every day new alternative platforms are springing out, offering radical explanations and creative solutions. And despite the brutal crackdown, what we have seen last year in Algeria, in Sudan, in Iraq, and briefly in Egypt, and what we're seeing today in Lebanon, tells us that the revolutionary spirit is still alive and that the Arab masses have not given up on their calls for justice and freedom. But if the past 5 years have taught us anything, is that no matter how large the crowds on the streets can be, without organization, they can be easily manipulated, if not actually crushed and controlled. As the Lebanese are saying today, the challenge is not to take to the streets, but the challenge is to remain on the streets. But controlling the streets requires stamina and fortitude. Above all, it requires organizational skills to transform small grassroots initiatives into permanent, formidable structures. In addition to the challenges of transitioning from mobilization to organization, what Arab masses now face is also the challenge of building trust and learning the art of political compromise. For decades, these tyrannical regimes have denied us the right of free association and perfected the art of sowing mistrust. I believe that the biggest challenge we now face is to build durable institutions, to trust each other, and to learn the art of political compromise. The tyrannical regimes that are ruling us were not built in a day, and certainly they will not be overthrown in one clean swoop. Our task is a huge one, and the learning curve is very, very steep. But I deeply believe that what we witnessed in 2011 is but the first step on our long quest for justice and freedom.
Thank you, Khaled. I would now like to introduce Alif Scott. Alif came to Edinburgh in 2014 with her new and illuminating book, Turkish Awakening. Since then, along with her incisive journalism, she has published Ottoman Odyssey, Travels Through a Lost Empire. Alif was previously based in Turkey, but is currently barred from that country. Her most recent book is Power and the People, about the radical origins of democracy. The question I would like to ask you, Alif, is, in your essay for Shifting Sands, you are already exploring where Turkey might be in 15 years' time, and hoping that civic courage, such as that displayed by people in the Gezi Park, might be a clue to Turkey's future. But Turkey, 5 years on, has emerged as an authoritarian state par excellence and a major regional power. Can you comment on these developments and what role, if any, civic courage plays in today's Turkey?
Thanks, Raja. Thank you. Well, rather like Khaled, I feel I must begin with a sort of proviso that the picture from Turkey, like the picture from Egypt, does indeed look depressing, especially when you put it in context in Turkey's case. So 5 years ago, opposition newspapers were still being printed and circulated. Now they're owned by pro-government businessmen, and largely toothless. The co-leaders of the leftist opposition People's Democratic Party were calling for greater civic rights and peace in the southeast of the country. Now they're both in maximum security jails on terrorist charges. But most importantly, 5 years ago, there had not yet been an attempted military coup that resulted in a paranoid government dismissing and arresting and jailing literally hundreds of thousands of academics, civil servants, teachers and journalists. As you mentioned, well, I was living in the country at that time. I've now been barred from re-entering Turkey. It's a life ban, and I'm one of the lucky ones. So I can still live freely abroad. My family, thank God, is safe, and that's not the case for many journalists and their families who have been put into jail or are in exile currently. But I think the most damaging legacy of the attempted military coup in 2016 was one of fear, an atmosphere of fear, of speaking one's mind, of trusting acquaintances, even friends, and a more general fear of survival, particularly for the younger generations who are hoping to build lives, forge careers, and build families in Turkey. So the outlook is bleak, not least right now because of a very dramatically tanking economy, but also because there does not seem much hope of change under President Erdogan and his government, which is increasingly authoritarian, as you mentioned, and his very hardline foreign policy, particularly at the moment. So I think, having said all that, it's even more extraordinary that civic courage is still in evidence in Turkey. Just the last few weeks, I've been really struck by the thousands of women who've been showing up to protest on the major streets of Turkey, despite peaceful protest effectively being illegal these days. They are resisting the proposed withdrawal of Turkey from the Istanbul Convention that was signed in 2011 that protects women from domestic abuse, underage marriage, and so on. And they showed up to protest in the context of worsening abuse countrywide, and particularly the shocking increase in femicides in the last few years. So women killed by their partners and former partners. Last year it was 474 women, and this year, largely because of the coronavirus lockdown, is expected to be much worse. So that's been extraordinary. There's been an online movement as well. It does take real courage to show up, particularly in person, to protest in Turkey. But that's something that I have been very moved by. As usual, these women were met by violence, by riot police. They still showed up. There was a real sense of solidarity and sisterhood within that movement. Moving on to oppositional newspapers. So as I mentioned, lots of the major papers that usually were quite critical of the government have been bought up and made sort of effectively redundant in their coverage. But there have been journalists in exile, or those who have lost their jobs, and they've set up two major, Aval and Duvar, these two online media outlets, which provide a much needed look behind the state propaganda that's being spewed out at the moment. And they serve a very important function now in a climate where people are hard pressed to find proper analysis and critical coverage of what's going on in Turkey. I mentioned the two HDP, People's Democratic Party co-leaders who are in jail at the moment. I love the fact that ordinary Turks still write to them. You know, I have a friend, she writes to Selahattin Demirtas, I'd say every few weeks. Bizarre that it sounds, that's not entirely risk-free in Turkey. She doesn't do that, she doesn't do that as someone who might do in a country where you can write to whoever you want and not worry that it's traced back to you. And it's dangerous to do something like that in Turkey. And I kind of love that she still does that. And she's not alone. He receives many hundreds of letters every week, I think. And I'd like to talk about civic courage at the ballot box as well. The most recent example we've seen of that was last year when an oppositional mayor was elected, acclaimed, in the elections in June. In Istanbul, he was elected, in fact, in March originally, but the government refused to accept that result and called for elections to be held again in June, and he won by an even greater margin the second time. So I think that's a really important episode because it shows that the attempted intimidation by the government of supporters of Imamoglu it failed. In fact, it backfired because it was so obviously a bullying tactic that people could see through, and they responded very defiantly to that. So that is, for me, civic courage distilled in the context of a local but extremely significant election. Istanbul is after all the cultural and economic heart of the country, despite Ankara being technically the capital.
Thank you, Elif. We have to leave it.
Okay.
So let me introduce next my colleague Salim Tamari. Salim is Professor Emeritus at Birzeit University, Palestine, and an editor of the Jerusalem Quarterly. Salim's latest books are The Great War and the Remaking of Palestine and Waqf Endowments in the Old City of Jerusalem, Changing Status and Archival Sources. So Salim, in your essay for Shifting Sands, you highlight the immense loss of life in World War I, where perhaps 1/6 of the population of Greater Syria, i.e. Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine, died. And you explain how this devastating war led to the demise of the Ottoman idea, the emergence of new forms of cultural and political identities. Well, we are in another time of great catastrophes. In the countries you know best, that once were Greater Syria, do you see new attitudes and ways of thinking coming forth? Salim, where are we heading?
Thank you. It's quite noteworthy that the Great War was followed by the major impact of the Spanish flu, or the epidemic, which took place exactly 100 years ago. And now we are witnessing the devastating effect of the COVID-19. And what I want to do is frame the impact of the beginning impact of the pandemic on the resistance movement and civil wars and revolutions that are taking place in much of the Middle East today. It is quite noteworthy that the spread of the pandemic has been inversely proportional to the casualties and deaths from civil war raging in good part of the Middle East and North Africa today. Libya, Yemen, Syria, and Iraq has had less cases than the relatively more stable governments in Egypt, Qatar, Algeria, and Morocco, perhaps as a result of the bullets getting to you before the disease. The pandemic has produced two opposite effects: an enhanced role for the state in controlling the epidemic with various degrees of success and failure, and a general rebellion against police restrictions triggered by impoverishment and economic collapse. It has also produced a surprising amount of solidarity for the stricken communities. The single positive achievement of the pandemic, if we can use that expression, has been to create a secondary economic crisis that has undermined and postponed Israel's attempt, with the encouragement of the Trump administration, to annex large areas of the occupied territories, the so-called Area C, to the Israeli state. We should perhaps, I'm talking here, of course, about the deal of the century proposed by Trump and the way in which a number of Arab states, especially in the Gulf, have been conniving in imposing this inequitable solution on the Palestinians. We should perhaps be thankful to COVID for this temporary, but only temporary relief. The pandemic occurs in the midst of raging civil wars and external intervention in key post-World War I states. Almost every state in the Arab East with the exception of Jordan and the Gulf states, have witnessed fissures leading to major internal destabilization and perhaps collapse. Egypt and the Maghreb states, Morocco, Algeria, and Tunis, seem to have been saved from these fissures either through their autocratic regimes or, in the case of Tunis, the only bright light in this grim picture, by the triumph of democratic reforms and the parliamentary democracy. Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, and now in Lebanon, the strain is accompanied by civil conflicts approaching civil war. In the first two cases, the old state has been able to reassert its authority at a great deal of expense. In Libya and Yemen, external intervention has given resurgence to tribalism and almost total illegitimacy of the central state. The most tragic consequence of the post-Sykes-Picot arrangement today is Lebanon. Ravished by economic collapse, nepotism, and a failed sectarian state, Lebanon is now devastated by the massive explosion we have witnessed in Beirut this week. Itself a consequence of a corrupt and corrupting government, or rather non-governing elite. As a result of this devastation and the collapse of the economy, Lebanon is now witnessing a year-old youth rebellion, which is pressing at grassroots overthrow of the ruling elites and its replacement with a representative non-sectarian state. In the midst of unparalleled catastrophe, a ray of hope is emerging for the whole Middle East. I should add that President Macron's visit this week to the devastated city, presenting himself as the savior of Lebanon, was a display of utter hypocrisy by the descendant of a regime which started the sectarian place in the first place almost a century ago. Altogether, the patrimony of the Sykes-Picot imperial division has failed to produce viable states with popular legitimacy. The rebellions of the Arab Spring of the last decade failed to engender structural change or popular representation, except perhaps in the case of the Tunisian Republic. And I'll speak more about this consequence when we come back.
Thank you, Salim. Our next speaker is Mai Al-Nakib. Mai is an associate professor of English and comparative literature at Kuwait University. She won the first book award in 2014 at the Edinburgh International Book Festival for her short story collection, The Hidden Life of Objects. She has now finished, congratulations, Mai, her first novel, Strange Birds, which traces the decline of Kuwait through the stories of 5 formidable women. Mai recently published a no-holds-barred article on the failures of Kuwait during the current pandemic in the Los Angeles Review of Books. Mai, hi. In your essay for Shifting Sands, you explored what life is like for writers living and working in the Middle East. You noted that it's a mirage to consider the Gulf states, as you said, an air-conditioned bubble in the middle of hell. What is the situation today for writers in the Gulf? And as Gulf economies falter, do you see cultural expressions changing? Will the Gulf governments continue to have disproportionate influence on cultural institutions and non-governmental organizations throughout our region? Thanks.
Thank you, Penny. Thank you, Raja. 5 years on, that bubble I mentioned has burst. The fraught future I anticipated has arrived, accelerated, and exacerbated by the global pandemic. Kuwait's inability to control the pandemic mirrors its inability to mitigate its many problems. We've passed the tipping point, and my projection of Kuwait's future is bleak. The problems I identified 5 years ago are the same ones threatening the country today. Our reliance on a single resource has proven catastrophic at a time when oil prices have slumped. In addition, our demographic imbalance, highlighted like never before during lockdown, reveals just how much essential work is being done by the 70% non-Kuwaiti residents. And while this realization should be pushing Kuwaitis to become more actively self-reliant, more motivated to take over the jobs that they normally wouldn't deign to do, it has instead intensified their racism. We hear calls for mass deportations without any consideration of how this would affect the country's already faltering economy and its overall sustainability, to say nothing of what it would do to the migrants themselves. Our already failing system of education has collapsed in the face of the pandemic, with government institutions closed and no attempt made to shift online. Our young people will have been deprived of 8 months of school and 5 months of university. While the healthcare system hasn't collapsed yet, therapies have been interrupted due to a lack of medications. And because our positivity rate remains so high, routine medical checkups and visits to hospitals remain unsafe. And the repercussions of this will be felt for years to come. What's true of the economy, demographic, education, and healthcare systems is equally true of every other aspect of the country. From social fragmentation and political corruption to curtailments of free expression and a devastated environment, the current situation is dire. We're at the start of a seismic shift in Kuwait and the Gulf region as a whole, after which nothing will be the same. Regardless of circumstances, writers write. But as nation states fall into economic, political, and social crises, governments tend to become more restrictive of expression in the name of security. So fiction will likely be prevented from doing what it does best, cultivating empathy, expressing different views, imagining alternatives to the present, revealing unexpected commonalities, experimenting wildly in all directions. And this is already happening in Kuwait. Writers, artists, and journalists must tread lightly lest they find themselves under interrogation or having cases brought against them by the public prosecutor. In 2018, 4 years after its publication, my collection of short stories, The Hidden Light of Objects, was banned by the Ministry of Information, joining more than 4,000 books banned over the last 5 years. No explicit reason is ever given for why a book is banned. A writer could take the case to court, and some writers have done so and won, but this requires effort and money, not to mention the time some of us would rather spend writing. Fighting a lost cause is not always the bravest or most righteous thing to do. Hoping against hope, writing against the impossible, struggling on, speaking the truth to power, even at the risk of imprisonment, sometimes it's asking too much of a writer. Sometimes all a writer wants is to spend their life figuring out what words can do, revisiting the past, experimenting with the future on paper. It's not easy for me to say this at a time when we witness such promising global activism, but it's more instinctive to unite and struggle against an obvious oppressor, a clear injustice. In Kuwait, it's generalized incompetence and decades-long mismanagement that have brought us to our present predicament. We, the people, have allowed this to happen, and no one is out on the streets demonstrating against it. Many who have attempted to forestall the decline have been sidelined, while our substandard system of education has produced generations ill-equipped to identify, let alone resolve, the overwhelming cascade of challenges we now face. I ended my essay in Shifting Sands with a reference to Edward Said, and I'll conclude my response today again with Said in mind. He often cited the words of Hugo of St. Victor, 12th century monk from Saxony, who wrote, "The person who finds his homeland sweet is still a tender beginner. He to whom every soil is as his native one is already strong, but he is perfect to whom the entire world is as a foreign place." To let go of borders and nationalisms, isms of all kinds really, and to embrace a planetary sensibility remains the surest path to our global survival. The pandemic is trying to teach us this lesson, but Kuwait seems incapable of heeding it. Fiction already offers us the entire world as a foreign place. We become better as we immerse ourselves in it, more perfect as we approach the world around us through its endless insights and images. As a writer, I continue to believe in the power of fiction. And like most writers, I will continue to write. But as a citizen of Kuwait, I know that fiction's promises aren't enough to save us. Given our record of ineptitude and the late hour, I'm not sure what can.
A bleak picture. Thank you, Mai. Let me now introduce Avi Schleim. Avi is an emeritus professor of international relations at the University of Oxford and a fellow of the British Academy. Among his books are The Iron Wall, Israel and Arab World, and Israel and Palestine, Reappraisals, Revisions, Refutations. Avi is a frequent and vigorous contributor to The Guardian and many other publications. The question to you, Avi, is this. In your essay for Shifting Sands, you argue that the order, in quotes, imposed by the European powers after World War I created a, quote, belt of turmoil and instability stretching from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf, unquote. Can the conflict and violence of the last 100 years be traced to this settlement? And can you be more specific about the Balfour Declaration and its impact on the subsequent history of Palestine?
Thank you, Raja and Penny. There is an Arabic saying that something that starts crooked remains crooked, and this is true of the order, so-called order, imposed by Britain and France on the Middle East after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire and the end of the First World War.
Hear, hear.
This was a victor's peace, which was designed to serve the interests of the imperial powers and was in flagrant disregard of the rights and aspirations of the population of the region. The main feature of this so-called order was lack of legitimacy. The rulers lacked legitimacy because they were not elected, they were handpicked by the imperial powers and imposed on the population. The political systems lacked legitimacy because they did not include any provisions for democracy. And the borders of the new Arab states lacked legitimacy because they were calculated to serve imperial interests rather than respond to the social and ethnic and religious realities of the region. So this post-war political and territorial order is what I call the Ottoman Syndrome. And as I wrote in the essay, and as you just quoted, this order created a belt of instability which stretched from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. And a great deal, not all, but a great deal of the instability, of turmoil, violence, conflict, bloodshed, and wars of the last 100 years can be traced directly to these origins. In 1916, Britain and France signed the Sykes-Picot Agreement that Salim had referred to. This was to divide up the Middle East into spheres of influence. In 2017, ISIS released a video about the end of Sykes-Picot. In it, they showed the blowing up of border posts in Iraq and Syria, and they said, we've done away with Sykes-Picot. ISIS history isn't accurate, they are not historians, but the Sykes-Picot Agreement is still of symbolic importance and relevance today. It is a symbol of the imperial carve-up of the Middle East at the expense of its inhabitants. Worse was to follow. In 1917, Britain issued the infamous Balfour Declaration in support of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. In 1917, the Arabs were 90% of the population of Palestine, the Jews were less than 10%, and the Jews owned only 2% of the land. And yet, Britain chose to accord national rights to the Jewish minority and deny it to the Arab majority. So this was a classic colonial document, and it permitted the systematic takeover of Palestine by the Zionist movement. Noam Chomsky once said that settler colonialism is the most extreme and vicious form of imperialism. The Palestinians have suffered the unique injustice. The Palestinians have been uniquely unfortunate in that they have been at the receiving end of both Zionist settler colonialism and Western imperialism. Looking forward to the future, I see no prospect of change between Israel and Palestine as long as Benjamin Netanyahu continues to represent Zionist settler colonialism and Donald Trump continues to represent Western imperialism. So I'm pessimistic about change for the good or justice for the Palestinians in the short term, but I'm optimistic in the longer term because a terrible injustice has been committed to the Palestinians. For the last century, they've been denied the right to self-determination. Israel today is an apartheid state, and in the 21st century, an apartheid system cannot last forever. So I'm pessimistic in the short term, but optimistic about change and justice in the long term. Thank you.
Thank you, Avi. Many thanks for all the panelists for these incisive presentations. We have one final question to put to you all, and I will answer it briefly because we're running out of time, and we'll start in the opposite order. So we'll start with Avi, and the question is, what are the main threats to a future of greater peace and equality in our region, and where can we look for sources of hope? Avi, please start.
The main threat to the future of our region comes from governments, both in the region and outside the region, Western governments. And there is very little prospect of change on the part of these governments. So the main hope for change comes from civil society. From civil society that has been mentioned in different contexts, but I would like to single out BDS, the grassroots global movement for ending the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories. That is a movement that is gaining traction and is really doing something to end the status quo. And in my comments, I laid much of the blame for the dismal state of the region on the outside powers. But they are not alone responsible for the present state of affairs. The local powers must have agency. And I noticed, and this is my last remark, that in Lebanon today, after the explosion, there is mass unrest and protests against the government, a call for a revolution, and a lot of Lebanese have signed a petition asking for return of the French mandate to Lebanon. So the main hope lies in civil society.
Thank you, Avi. Mai, could you have a go?
Sure. I think the primary threat is our degraded system of education. Next, the threat of economic collapse. And then connected to those two, the threats of corruption, unaccountability, ineptitude, negligence, and then also our lack of concern about the environment. In terms of hope, I think that these are really dark days and it's difficult to speak about hope without sounding delusional. And so I think maybe it's time to stop relying on hope. Maybe always this kind of hope for tomorrow has been our region's panacea for too long. And without hope, we're sort of reduced to focusing on the here and now, bitter and awful as it is. But that awful bitterness might be the thing we need to kickstart a different approach, one that might be able to move us in a different direction than the trajectory that we've been on. Having said that, there are no guarantees that different will mean better, but maybe it's worth a try.
Thank you. Salim, could you have a go, please?
Well, I think the failure of civil society to challenge the repressive regimes in the aftermath of the Arab Spring is now being presented with a different scenario, because the pandemic principally is leading to internal economic collapse and the inability of regimes to deliver the minimum basis of survival to many Middle Eastern states. So that impending economic collapse may be a trigger for a revival of civil society as we see today in Lebanon, that will more likely, with different degrees of success, to challenge the repressive regime. In the case of the region I live in, Palestine, the most dominant feature of this contradiction is the insistence of the Israeli state to legitimize and consolidate an apartheid state, which in our case is leading to the collapse of the possibility of separation in two states. And this may give rise, hopefully, to a vision of a unitary state that in itself might mobilize people, certainly from among the Palestinians, but possibly due to these economic contradictions within the Israeli states to create an alternative multinational reality.
I wish we had more time to elaborate more on this. Alif, you have a go, please.
Well, I think my fellow participants have described very eloquently what the problems are. And I particularly identify with Mai's point that hope can seem this slightly ethereal thing that seems to get us through the psychological difficulties of the troubles that this region is facing. I can't answer your question directly, it's too complicated, it's too difficult, but sometimes I do play thought experiments with myself about what would happen if tomorrow we were woke up and all the oil had disappeared from the Middle East, or all the male authoritarian leaders had been replaced by fully functioning citizens' assemblies with at least the 50% female representation, things like that. I feel those are almost more cheering and more thought-provoking than the more solutions we look at.
Indeed. Khaled, please.
I too agree with Avi that the main problem is the regimes, the internal regimes that have decimated our societies and offered us a very debased formula of either giving up, of either insisting on social economic rights or political and constitutional rights. Or right now, they're basically saying, like the one in Egypt, we cannot guarantee your mere existence and your stability. So these are very debased alternatives that these regimes are confronting, are offering us. And I think the biggest challenge for us is actually to imagine another world in which we should be entitled to all of these rights. And we talk about civil society as if it's an invention, not we, but it's often presented as if it's an invention of some organizations, international organizations of the past 20, 30 years. But civil society is what we had before the creation of these modern nation states. And the biggest thing for me, for example, as a historian, is to tell our students and to tell myself, to try and imagine what life looked like for the creation of these states, and that it was possible to have something that is proving very, very difficult because of these current regimes. So that is the biggest challenge we have now: is our regimes, how to tame them, how to wish them away, but also maintain our trust in each other and our trust in civil society.
Absolutely. Penny, over to you.
Thank you to everybody, Khaled, Alif, Salim, Mai, and Avi, and also to our audience once we get there. We wish we could hear our audience and respond to all the comments and questions. And please don't forget to visit the festival's wonderful independent online bookstore via the Book Festival website. All events in this special festival are free for everyone, thanks to the generosity of supporters and sponsors. So if you can, consider making a donation to the Edinburgh International Book Festival in order that the festival team can continue to putting on events for as many people as possible. And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.